All right, so today we're going to be starting a new series, and this one is called The Theology of Everyday Things. And this first lesson is called How to Cut a Cake Using the Doctrine of Sin. Now, if you might read this, you might be thinking, okay, this is obviously a metaphor for something, but I want to assure you that it's not. We are actually going to discuss in this class practical things you can do with theology, and one of the things we're going to start with today is how we can literally cut cake better using the doctrine of sin. So that might sound surprising, but we'll get to that, and we'll get to why we're doing this and what the importance of this lesson is. Because I think what we're covering in this series is actually very important to the usage uh, of theology in all aspects of your life. All right. Now, before I get into everything, first of all, we need to talk about what is theology. Okay, because a lot of people are confused about what theology is. They say, okay, well, theology is about God. Well, that's true. Theology starts with God. Um, we all think about theology as just being the study of God, but it goes beyond that. But let's start about theology and God. Okay, so there's a lot of different aspects to theology, and I'm going to give you a lot of terms. And the point of these terms is not that I want you to memorize these terms or anything like that. I just want to point out to you that these different aspects are things that people have put a lot of thought into, such that they even have their own terms for them. Okay, so some areas of theology that deal with God include paterology, which is the theology of the Father. Okay, so pater comes from the uh, word for Father. Christology is the theology of Jesus Christ the Son. Pneumatology is the theology of the Holy Spirit. Bibliology, bibliology is the theology of God's revealed word. And eschatology is the theology of the end times, or God's final plan. Okay, so a lot of these areas they deal with God and things directly about God, but actually theology itself keeps going. Theology is actually about the study of everything else that comes from a God-centered viewpoint. Okay, so if you're viewing the world through the lens of a God-centered worldview, this continues to be theology. So other common areas of theology include anthropology, which is the theology of humans. There's also a science of anthropology, which is different. They both come from anthropos, which is the Greek word for man. Then there's hamartiology, which is the theology of sin. There's soteriology, which is the theology of salvation. There's one that's a little bit newer and so it doesn't have a cool Greek word, and that's natural theology, which is the theology of the natural world. And the list goes on. So there's all sorts of specific areas of theology that deal with different parts or aspects of what the world looks like from a God-centered viewpoint. Now, the goal of this series is that I want us to have our entire lives be Christ focused. Okay, I don't want just a lot of people view theology and Christianity as just being about, how to get to heaven and how to be moral on earth. Right? And that's as far as they think that theology goes. Right? Well, I want our whole lives to be Christ focused, not just the moral part, not just the salvation part. I want the whole thing. Okay. And what happens, I find a lot of times, is that our imaginations limit what parts of our lives we put under Christ because we just literally can't think of what it would look like to put this other area under Christ. All right. So we have this, our imagination limits what we can do because if we can't imagine it, it's hard to put it into practice. So my goal is to expand your vision of theology. Okay, and so I'm going to introduce lots of little sketches of how theology can be put into practice, because I want to think about putting everything in accordance with our Christian walk. Okay, and so seeing these things applied practically will help us understand the truth of the theological understanding of the world. Okay, we oftentimes it's not truth is not identical to practicality, but in America we tend to kind of think that way, and that if something has practical value to it, it's true. And so when we see practical applications of theology, it will help reinforce to us the truth of the theological understanding the world. And my hope is that we can expand our imagination of what theology is and what it does to help you make beneficial use of theology in your own life. Now, I don't imagine that like each of these sketches you'll think, oh, I know how to apply that. Here's how we're going to apply it right here, right now. Or here's how I'm going to change my life to view it more theologically and do it tomorrow. Okay, my goal here, this is a longer term view. I want you to just kind of expand the way that you think about the world. I can imagine this taking uh, months or years before you can really see how all these things fit together in your own life. But it won't ever happen if you don't start thinking about it at some point. And so my goal is to get you start thinking about it now, and so that it'll bear fruit later on. So I want you to be I want you to use this as a springboard to help you reimagine the role of theology in your everyday life. Okay. Now, again, as I mentioned, in America, we tend to judge things to be true by whether or not they have a practical benefit. Okay, and the way that I phrase this sometimes, I like to say that we believe something is true if we can use that truth to build a better iPhone. I mean, that's the long and short of it. If we can use this truth to build a better iPhone, it's true. Otherwise, it's more of a personal preference, right? And that's usually where we put theology if we're going to be honest with ourselves. We usually put theology in the personal preference space. And the reason is because we lack the imagination to utilize theology in a practical matter. So theology and what you think about theology becomes more like a Star Wars versus Star Trek. Neither of them are true. It's just whichever one gives you the most inspiration, and that's how we tend to think about theology. All right, but I believe that theology is about truth. There are theologies that are true and theologies that are false, and we can see this more clearly when we put theology to practical use and see where the truth of theology leads to better outcomes. Okay, so in this course, while most of the time when people are talking about theology, they're um, they're trying to expand and improve your spiritual nature. In this course, we're going to look at the practical applications of theology, not the spiritual applications. All right? So, with that, we're going to do our warm-up exercise, which is how to cut a cake using the doctrine of sin. And as I said, you might think this is metaphorical, but I promise you it's not. So, let's imagine that you're in the kitchen and there's a cake and there's one piece of cake left. And you have two children come into the room and they both want a piece of cake. What do you do? Well, I ask this a lot and I get a variety of answers. One of it is people say, we'll just divide the cake in half, right? Well, now the thing that's going to happen is that if you divide the cake in half for these two children, they're both of them will think that they got the smaller piece. Both of them will be unhappy with the way that you sliced it. Um, if you let the person who has the most skill in cutting cut it, you'll still have the same result. So the problem is that um, there's we all have sinful natures in us, even children. Children have sin natures, and that's what's coming out is their sin nature. This desire for more, this selfishness, this inner selfishness, this comparison, this is what's coming out. And so, in order to cut the cake the best, you actually have to neutralize their their sin natures in some way. You have to neutralize them in some way, and one of the easiest way to do that is to set them against each other. And so the way that you do that is you have uh, one kid cut the cake and the other kid choose the piece. And so by setting their sin natures against each other, you can get it so that they can that their the more virtuous part will prevail. Okay, and so this is obviously this isn't rocket science, but it is a practical application of theology. So so this all comes as part of the doctrine of sin. So let's talk a little bit more about the doctrine of sin and what it tells us. Okay, so in the doctrine of sin, there's a distinction between individual sins and the sinful nature of humanity. So you can have a sinful nature even without specifically committing particular sins. Okay, what that means is that sin is an innate part of all humanity. It's not a piece. It's not like I have a sin in my left arm or I'm sinning when I do this. No, sin is a corruption that's spread throughout. Okay. Now, the in believers, if you're a believer, then your nature as a person is no longer to sin, but your fleshly nature is still sinful. So you're still motivated by the desires of the flesh. Okay, and so that brings about sin. So since we're talking about sin, we should look at what the Bible says about sin. A good just passage to really get the heart of what sin is like is Psalm 51, and just a great read on humanity's inherent sinful state. But Romans talks a lot about the systematic theology of sin. Okay, we know that sin came through Adam, so we're all affected because we all are all offspring of Adam. There's a real heavy emphasis on the bodily nature of sin, that it's in our flesh. It's these desires in our flesh, and the thing is, you can see this in the nature of sin, right? Think about the ways that people sin. Are any of them surprising? Are you ever surprised at the way that somebody sins? No, we've been sinning the same way today that we sinned 1,000 years ago, right? Um, we didn't invent brand new ways to sin, brand new sins that no one ever thought of before. No, these are the same sins that are going over and over again. And the reason why we're getting the same sins over and over again is because they're largely connected to our body and our feelings and things that are very tied into our biochemistry and the things that our body wants. Okay, and so that's why gluttony, sexual immorality, even wanting pleasure, wanting not to feel bad. These are all things that are really just it's our fleshly desires. And so I wouldn't say that sin is entirely just flesh, but there is a large component of our sinful nature that's driven by our flesh. Um, Romans 3:21 through 26 says we're all sinners, but we're all made righteous through Jesus. Okay, so everybody's sinners. Um, all have sinned. There's not any of us who can say, "Oh, I'm not part of the sinning class." No, we are all we all have this sinful fleshly nature. And this is not just Romans, also in First John, it talks about all of us being sinners. If you say that you're without sin, you're a liar. So we're all sinful. Okay, and that's the big idea about sin that comes from the Bible, because all throughout humanity, people try to think about themselves as sin is other people, right? But in Christianity, sin is everyone. Okay, so the doctrine of sin has a lot of corollaries. Okay, and this is really brought out. There's a book called A Conflict of Visions by Thomas Sowell, and he kind of shows that there's kind of two ways of viewing the world, and I don't think he actually uses the term the doctrine of sin, but really one of them is based on the doctrine of sin, where it's kind of a tragic view of who humans are, and the other one is a view that humanity itself can be improved, that we can have a better humanity tomorrow than we do today. Okay, so so some corollaries to the doctrine of sin is that sin can't be externalized into things. Okay, sin is in us. It's part of you. You can't get rid of sin by getting rid of any outside person, object, or system. You can't say, "Oh, look, there's sin over there." You can't say, "Oh, if we get rid of these people, then we'll have a just society." Or, there's no place outside of us that you can locate it. If there's people in it, there's sin. Okay. The other thing on the doctrine of sin is that even in good acts, there are sinful behaviors and motives lurking. If you ever see the TV show Friends, there's a great episode where Phoebe um, uh, believes in these completely altruistic acts, and Joey's like, no, in everything, there's something selfish in it. And so Phoebe goes through the entire episode trying to do something that's completely unselfish, and Joey's always pointing out the unselfish parts, or the selfish parts of whatever it is that she's doing. Um, and so even in good acts, there's sinful motives lurking. Even if it's like we want to feel good about ourselves, we want other people to think well of us. Um, there's these sinful behaviors that are kind of wandering around there, even in our best acts. And that's not to say that we shouldn't be striving to do good things, but just we have to recognize that even our best parts, even our most pure thoughts, there is woven in it a sinful nature. The other thing is sin is present in everyone. Okay? There's no good people and bad people. There's just people. And sin is in all of us. Now, the thing about sin, the other thing though, is that individuals can be improved. Okay? And they can be improved through redemption and sanctification. Right? So when Christ redeems us, then we're not tied to our sinful nature. We might still uh, behave according to it, but we're not tied to it. And so we can learn individually to crucify the desires of the flesh. We can also raise a new generation with that understanding, but we have to do it on an individual by individual basis. The new generation starts out right back in the same sinful situation, and on top of that, they not only are in that same situation, um, but uh, they they have to be individually trained up uh, to go in the right direction. Okay, so that everybody's starting sinful. The best that we could probably do is to improve our systems of raising people up, redeeming them, and getting them sanctified. So you could actually think of the church essentially kind of like a technology of some sorts to help this process along. Okay, but in general, we're never going to start with humans starting from a different starting point. They're all going to be, we all start with the sinful nature. So humanity itself can't be improved because future humans always start with the same sin starting point. Now, we might have different sins at different times, um, but ultimately we all have the same nature. And so what the doctrine of sin does is it prevents us from making bad solutions to problems. Okay, because there's a lot of problems where people propose bad solutions. And so the doctrine of sin, one of the things that it can do that's really helpful is prevent us from choosing really wrong solutions. And one of my favorite books is The Irony of American History. It's by Reinhold Niebuhr, and it's a super short book, but it's one of the longest short books I've ever read. Just every sentence is quotable. If you just wrote down a list of quotes from the book, you'd basically rewrite the entire book. Um, so he focuses on the tendency of governments and peoples and systems to try to externalize sin. And so he kind of goes over two different ways this is done, one in the West and one in the East. And he said in the East, their big, I guess you could call it a heresy, was to externalize sin into property. Okay, and that's what communism was. It basically said that the reason for sin in society is property. And if we just got rid of property, then people would no longer be motivated to sin. That's where all the sinful motivations are coming from. So it's in property. So communism, you can say, okay, sin is in property. We're going to excise the property, and then we won't have sin anymore. Wonderful. And then in Western democracies, we did something similar. We thought sin was localized in ignorance. So we said, okay, well, if we educate, right? Now, don't get me wrong, I'm a big fan of education. I spend a lot of my time educating. I spend a lot of my time writing for other people to educate from. I believe in education, but education is not a solution to the problem of sin. If you just educate sinners, what you're going to wind up with are really intelligent criminals. All right. So sin can't be externalized into ignorance. Sin is in us. We're not getting rid of people's internal sinful nature when we make them smarter. Okay. And then more recently, this is not in his book, but more recently we have critical race theory, which externalizes sin into whiteness. It says those white people, they are the ones that are causing the societal problems. And what's really sad about critical race theory is that there's a lot of valid problems that they bring up, uh, but the problem is that their solution completely misses because it completely ignores the theology of sin. It misunderstands the doctrine of sin and therefore misunderstands the human person. And therefore its solutions don't actually work. In fact, if you even take the logic of their own solutions to the end, you can see that they're actually self-destructive. Because in critical race theory, for example, one of the propositions is that there's no such thing as reverse racism because racism is the combination of prejudice and power. Okay. The problem with that definition, though, is that again it misunderstands the nature of sin, because the problem is the sin, right? The sin of prejudicial thinking. And so um, if you only make it a problem when there's power associated with it, so what they're basically doing is they're basically getting a free pass to sin to everyone who doesn't have power. Okay, and you can see how. So let's presume that the people in critical race theory succeed in changing the power dynamics. Okay. Well, if they make the power dynamics so that all of a sudden people of color are now the people who have the strong power in society, but they've let everyone who are people of color have prejudicial thoughts without tampering them. Well, in overnight, as soon as they achieve their goal of flipping the power base, they will have made all of those people go from being quote unquote good people to quote unquote problematic people because they will have they will now have the power, but they're going to have the same attitudes and prejudices that they had the day before. And so by linking uh, by only making it sinful if there's power associated, you misunderstand that when you finally get power, you still need to be virtuous, and it's misunderstanding the nature of the situation. Um, so that basically they're just setting them up to have a failing system, just failing in a different direction, even if they succeed. So another common one that happens these days is anarchism, and there's a lot of people who are anarcho-capitalists, and they are externalizing sin into government. They think that having government that government is kind of the source of societal sin, and that by getting rid of government, that they'll get rid of social of sin in society. So anyway, so all of these are different ways of externalizing sin, and I'm sure if we sat and thought about it, we could think of a lot more. So and all of these, what they do is they fail to recognize our own individual and our own group's complicity in problems. As I said, sin is not out there, sin is in here. And until we come to grips with that, we're going to be proposing bad solutions to problems. Um, so another thing the on bad solutions. So this is Thomas Sowell. He's one of my heroes. Um, we have to recognize people's motivations. Again, as I said, if you have a sinful nature, you're going to have selfish motivations even in the best of times. So bad solutions tend to ignore selfish motivations. Okay, and along with this is that brings unintended consequences of any policy. And this isn't just government policy. This is business policy, company policy, organizational policy, any sort of policy you can think of. If you ignore selfish motivations, you're going to get unintended consequences. Because every policy is going to be gamed to some extent because we are sinful people. And if you say no, people are only going to follow the policy in the way that we intend, right? Well, no, that's not how people work. Um, Again, we all have a sinful nature, and if you don't recognize that, you're going to make bad policy choices because you're going to misunderstand the people that this is applied to. So the doctrine of sin, though, doesn't just prevent bad solutions to problems, it also promotes good solutions to problems. Um, so the thing that the doctrine of sin will do, if you use it well, is it'll make selfish motivations work in the favor of goodness. And basically, the way it does this is by it basically immobilizes the selfish motivations by putting them in tension with other things, so that the selfish motivations essentially cancel out. Again, because the selfish motivations are very predictable. It's mostly comes from the flesh, from the body, and so you can kind of see how, um, because these are very simple, straightforward motivations, it's oftentimes fairly simple to see how you can put them in tension with one another to kind of cancel them out. So to give it, just to go back to our initial example, we had the example of cutting the cake. Well, they actually have the exact same analog to this in contract law. So in contract law, what you have is that if I write a contract, um, and you sign it. Okay. Well, if there's any ambiguities in the contract, since I wrote it, those ambiguities are ruled in favor of whatever is favorable to you. Okay. So basically, I'm cutting the cake by writing the contract, and you're choosing the piece by resolving any ambiguities in your favor. And so contract law has that exact same idea, and it comes from the exact same place, this notion of the doctrine of sin. And in fact, historically, we have specifically used the language of the doctrine of sin in discussions about the role of law in society. In more recent years, that's kind of been phased out, and that's kind of gone with it has been uh, the usefulness of law, the ability of law, um, basically the better usage of law has kind of declined because it no longer understands this basic idea about people, about the doctrine of sin. Similarly, there's the market economy. What does the market economy do? Well, if I want to be selfish in the market economy, what do I have to do? Well, I have to sell things to people. That means I have to do something to someone. Okay, so the market economy, for it to work, if I want to be selfish, I can only be selfish by being unselfish, by doing something for you. So if you think about other kinds of economies, other kind of economies like if maybe for the king, I would curry favor with the king so he'd give me stuff. All right. Well, I'm not doing anything beneficial for anyone. I'm just getting the system to get me money. Right. So the king is going to make the peasants work harder. Then he's going to give me a cut of that. All right. So that's um, so the selfishness is the same in both systems. It's just in one system I'm offsetting it by saying, okay, well, if someone's going to be selfish, how do I make sure that that to the best extent that I can? I mean, obviously, you can't completely get rid of the bad effects of sinfulness, but you can say, what can I do to mitigate this? How can I take our sinful motivations, especially if we think about the ones that are intermixed with our more altruistic ones? How can we take those and immobilize the sinful nature so that the virtuous part of us can be more free. And that's not to say that the market economy is the end all and be all. It's just if you propose another economic um, economic system, it has to take into account the the doctrine of sin. Because most of the ones that I've seen that have attempted to move past market economics, they ignore the doctrine of sin, and that's why they all fail. Um, so you have to take the doctrine of sin into account. You have to recognize that people are innately sinful. So another two books, Thomas Sowell has one called Knowledge and Decisions, and one of the things he points out in this is that with a lot of revolutions, what happens? You have one group of people in power, and they're disgruntled, and so you have Group A, and they're in power, and you have Group B, they're not in power, and Group B is disgruntled. Okay, and so what happens? Well, Group B overthrows Group A. All right, now Group B is in power, and Group A is disgruntled, and then you have a continual flip-flop of these things. What Sowell pointed out is that in the American Revolution, it wasn't just swapping who's on top, because that's what happened in the French Revolution. In the French Revolution, they just swapped who's on top. In the American Revolution, they changed how decisions were made. Okay, and by changing how decisions were made, and not just saying, "Oh, here's the results," they were able to institute a system that had a more widespread common sense of justice. So here's some ways that you can utilize the doctrine of sin to promote good solutions to problems. So one of them is force people with opposing interests to keep each other in check. So by recognizing where the interests are and by saying, okay, well, these interests oppose each other and therefore they can keep each other in check, you can keep the sin nature at bay. Right? So we do this with our three branches of government because not only do we have three branches of government, the branches of government actually have different power bases. Um, the House of Representatives, for example, is the local power base. The president is the national power base. Uh, the judicial is kind of the power base of currying favor with the political class. And then it used to be that we even had senators had a different power base where the senators were chosen from the state apparatus. So each state, not the people of the state, but the state apparatus itself would choose the senators. So you had these different opposing uh, opposing power bases, and because the power bases were opposed, they kept each other in check. And this is kind of why the move to make everything have a similar power base is so problematic, where we're trying to make uh, the elections be based on popular vote, just like the representatives are. Well, that's again that then they'll all have the same power base, and therefore kind of the sinful natures won't be as opposed to each other. As I said, we have two houses of Congress, again, because they have two different power bases. So I'm going to leave you with uh, basically three general principles. Okay. First of all, the importance of process over outcomes. Okay, because so in processes, if you have a process, then you can oftentimes stand back and specify a process that is more just than if you try to specify outcomes. Because if you try to specify outcomes, you're always going to be thinking in terms of what makes you look good. But if you're specifying a process, you're recognizing that you could actually wind up being on either side of this process. And so you're more likely to specify a process that is more just. Okay. Then specifically on policy, um, decision makers should have a stake in the outcome. And the reason for this is because if you make sure that decision makers have a stake in the outcome, then they're more likely to make policies in such a way that makes sense, right? So this is why we get so frustrated with government policies, is because our government tends to not live by its own policies. OSHA requirements do not apply to the federal government. Okay, so they make when they make policies for everybody else but don't follow them themselves, then that means that they wind up really not caring about how good the policies are or how hard they are to implement because they don't have to do it themselves. So that's the book Skin in the Game by Nassim Nicholas Taleb is a really good book on the subject about how having skin in the game, having the effect of this policy actually impact your own life, makes you make better decisions. So that's on policy. On the other side, on justice, decision makers should not have a stake in the outcome. And the reason for this is simple. On justice, we're trying to weigh the relative justice of things. And we're always going to think that we're more just than our opponents. And so by uh, saying that we shouldn't have a stake in the outcome, what we're doing is we're removing that amount of selfishness. So this is why we're judged by a jury of our peers, but the first thing they ask you is if anyone knows the defendant, right? Because if you know the prosecutor or the defendant, then your ability to render a just judgment is impaired, right? And so that's again the doctrine of sin. All right, so that's that's this lesson, the doctrine of sin. So our next lessons, uh, the next lesson is going to be how to make cheese using the doctrine of creation, and the lesson after that is how to build artificial intelligence using the doctrine of man. And hopefully, as you can tell from this lesson, how to cut a cake using the doctrine of sin, I'm not being metaphorical on either of these. I'm being quite straightforward. We literally went through what the process of cake cutting and what it looked like, and what difference the doctrine of sin made in the process of cutting cake. And so we'll see how that plays out in the process of making cheese and in the process of building artificial intelligence. So anyway, I hope you stay with us, and I hope you enjoy the series.